Yeah.
Oh, 100%. One of these is better.
Anyway, Louis, I'll see you later.
Okay, yes.
Good afternoon. I'm honored and it's my pleasure to introduce you to Marta Santuccio, who has come to us from Italy.
From Ibiza, actually.
Ibiza?
Yeah.
That sounds cool, actually.
It was, I know.
She has a PhD in philosophy. It was a study she finished last summer on metaphysics and extended consciousness. But she's also now working, and that was part of her research in that philosophy PhD, on expanded consciousness and embodiment. And she's facilitating work in that now. She's also a holotropic breathwork facilitator. And she's talking to us about the practice she has developed. So this is not so much an abstract philosophy theory talk. This is more about the work Marta is doing now. Yeah. Thank you very much, Marta.
Thank you. Thanks for the lovely introduction. And hi, everyone. I'm not really sure if I want to stay here or stay on this side. So I think I'm going to walk a little bit. And is it a good? Yeah, I'm just going to walk. So yeah, today I'm going to present, as Christian said, the practice that I developed. And as you can see from the slide, this practice is called Contemplative Embodiment. So what we're going to do in this talk is we're going to look at what contemplative embodiment is and how I came up with this label and this practice. And also look at how I use contemplative embodiment, and that's to support the preparation and integration of psychedelic states and to create a new set of data for the study of metaphysics. Do you want me to do something? I think you can leave it like that. Yeah. Anything works. Okay. So what is contemplative embodiment? Contemplative embodiment is a method or a practice that brings together experiences in non-ordinary states, and specifically experiences that are not substance-based, together with tools that we borrow from metaphysical inquiry to support the exploration of reality beyond the visible. Okay, so that's the tagline, to support the exploration of reality beyond the visible. And what I mean by reality beyond the visible, very briefly, is the reality of hidden emotion, and or it's the range of experiences that go from the hidden or stuck emotions, from what Jung called shadow, all the way to experiences of immanent divinity, experiences of deep connection with the cosmos, for example, or of awareness of divine love, for instance. Okay, so the central intuition, let's say, to contemplative embodiment is that reality is much broader than the reality that we live in, that the self is much wider than what we are born or what we are taught to think, than the way that we conceptualize. So reality is much, much wider than the reality of matter, than the reality of tables and chairs, than the reality that we're inhabiting now in this normative state of consciousness as I talk to you and you listen to me. And the cool thing is that this wider expanse of reality is very easily accessible, and it's accessible through the body. Deep embodied states can work as a door to access these more expanded versions of reality. And this is the central intuition, the central fact of contemplative embodiment. The second intuition or facts that motivate my research, that motivate my practice with my playing with contemplative embodiment, let's say, is the fact that this more expansive version of reality, these more expansive versions of the self, are the subject matter of both experiences in non-ordinary states, of psychedelic experiences, and as well of metaphysics. When we do psychedelics, for example, we shoot out into a wider expanse of reality. We see that the matter of chairs melts, the fabric of time, we can enter the fabric of time and play with it, for example. But at the same time, when we do metaphysics, we wonder, what is reality? What is the fundamental nature of reality? Is reality the way science tells us? Or is reality made of mind? So in both metaphysics in both metaphysics and psychedelics, in both fields, we access and explore this more expansive version of reality. The other thing that non-ordinary states of consciousness and metaphysics have in common is the act of deconstruction, deconstructing the reality that we live in experientially or conceptually. And this act of deconstruction is also central to contemplative embodiment. And we will see as we move along in the presentation what I mean by deconstruction. So we have two parallels between non-ordinary states of consciousness and metaphysics. They explore a wider, more expansive version of the self and reality. And they both work by a process of deconstruction of the old framework, of our prior framework, to create a new one, to explore the unknown. So a disclaimer that I always say when I work with people is, this is not a therapy, this is not psychology, this is mode of being. When we start going into embodiment, what will happen, we will not be cured, we will not be more aware of what happened with our parents or what happened in certain traumatic events of my life. But this is more about shifting our way to navigate reality from a mind first to a more whole approach to existing, really. So it's not a therapy, it's not psychology, although it can work out to have some therapeutic effect. And this is my little disclaimer. Right, so I think the best way to understand what contemplative embodiment is to give you a little bit of my history. So as Christine said, I just finished defending my PhD in philosophy, but I've not always been a philosopher. So I've always been a very, very curious person. And when I finally started doing philosophy, my mom was like, okay, finally, like obviously you were supposed to do philosophy, because I was always asking questions. As a teenager, I was obsessed with asking, like, do you think is time prior to space? Is space prior to time? Right now, I don't even know if these questions make sense, but I was always curious about what lays beyond. And so I think retracing my history will give you a better grasp of what contemplative embodiment is. So apart from these little excursus into my childhood, I started working with embodiment when I was living in London, and I was doing my law degree. Really, really boring time for me intellectually. So what I started doing was I was writing a lot, and I slowly started creating immersive environment, what then in my years of practice became, I started calling spaces for subjective exploration. These were basically rooms like this, wherein I changed the sensory stimulations according to, well, the study of embodiment, studying how to stimulate people in order to get a sense of presence, a sense of being here and now. So these were spaces for subjective exploration, because by entering these spaces, we would have a really powerful embodied experience. We would just sort of go into the feeling that I am here, I am now, I am present. And these experiences usually pushed the person to really feel their way around the room. This slowly also became meditative spaces as my practice kept moving along. At the same time, I was also super curious about meditation and practices. Like I was studying Reiki, I was exploring a lot of work. I apprenticed with a shaman. I was interested in out-of-body experiences. I was really curious, and I was doing this for my own personal pleasure. And but at the same time, like amongst all these practical things that I was doing, I always felt like I had something missing. Something for me was missing. And what was missing was a bit more of theoretical underpinning. I was drawn to the big question. So, okay, amazing. I can have this experience, but is the experience enough for me? Is this experience enough? So I was really thirsty for some sort of framework, and not necessarily a theory. Oh, okay, I'm having this experience because the world is such and such. But I felt like I needed maybe some more tools to make sense of that experience. And so from being an artist, I decided that I would look into philosophy. And I started studying philosophy, and this led me to get a PhD. So I didn't go from artist to PhD. I did some other studying in the middle, but yeah, that's the short version. And I started doing my PhD. At the same time as doing my PhD, I also was going through a really deep personal crisis. And I was so lucky to encounter holotropic breathwork. So I did my first holotropic breathwork, and I was like, wow, that's incredible. I'm having the most psychedelic experience with no substance ever. And so I started doing holotropic breathwork for my own personal healing. And at the same time, I was doing philosophy. You should know that my philosophy thesis was on the metaphysics of consciousness. So the whole point of my work was to ask questions about the fabric of reality, as you might expect from my introduction. So yeah, I found myself in this sort of bipolar almost experience where I was going out and having these really deep experiences. And then I was coming back home and studying metaphysics, like reading and writing and taking notes all in my head, and then totally in my body, and then all in my head. And then I slowly started seeing that the more I progressed, the deeper I went with the questioning in my PhD, the more expansive my experiences with holotropic breathwork became. The more I could go from the biographical to more transpersonal experiences, the wider, we could say, the space for my psychedelic journey could become. And then again, once I went back to studying my PhD, I felt like I had a huge amount of data that was available to me, not only to make the theory, but really to think beyond the box. So I didn't find data the way you find data in science. Okay, this happened, and therefore I can stick this into my PhD, and it's data there. But there was something beautiful happening in the interaction between my experiences in expanded states and my doing metaphysics. So I started playing a lot with that. Okay, wow, how is this working? Let's explore that. Can I have embodied experiences while doing metaphysics? Can I use metaphysics while I'm doing embodied experiences? How does that work? And so that's how the rest of my PhD became a lot more fun, and my expanded consciousness experiences became a lot wider. And needless to say that my PhD, that was actually, it passed with no correction, so people liked it. It's not just crazy stuff that I said. It was really interesting to see how this impacted my philosophy making in a way that could be accepted within the academic world, right? So that was something really powerful for me. And at the same time, I was also working with clients. I had been working with clients for a while. And I was working mainly with like embodiment. And they started becoming curious about what it is that you're writing about. You always tell us about your PhD, you're always being like super nerdy about consciousness and science and the limits of science. Why don't you tell us about it? So I started introducing questions, like the basic questions that we ask in metaphysics, like, is my body separate from my mind? Or could we conceive of ourselves as embodied people? Is the mind spread throughout the body? Or what is the fabric of the, what do you think the fabric of the universe is like? Some people say it's physical. Some other people say it's mental. What do you think? Can you go from this idea to the experience? I started playing with that. And what I realized, is that people loved it. And people loved it because it gave them support to explore or to make sense of the experiences that they were having when doing holotropic breathwork, when doing Kambo, when doing ayahuasca, and so on. And so that's how the idea of that's how contemplative embodiment was born. It was just by the end of my PhD that I realized, oh, okay, I'm working with this, the unseen. I'm working with this expanded notion of reality. And what is constitutive of this is the tools that I'm borrowing from metaphysical research, and is the embodied experiences that I'm having in non-ordinary states. So, and this is how the notion of contemplative embodiment sort of, well, the practice of contemplative embodiment came to me. It was really organic. So I realized that I was doing contemplative embodiment after doing contemplative embodiment, if that makes sense. Okay, so now I've been talking about embodiment for a bit. How do you guys know what embodiment is? Who doesn't? Okay, cool, amazing, I love that. Because embodiment is actually like a really cool world in the healing space right now. So I was thinking maybe everyone knows about it, but I love explaining what embodiment is because I think it's very basic. I think it's a very basic, I'm gonna show my political cards here. I think it's super obvious that we are embodied beings, but we don't grow into thinking that we are. So it's a huge discovery sometimes when we start conceiving or perceiving ourselves as fully embodied. Okay, so what are embodiment practices? Embodiment practices are practices that have at their core the idea that the mind is coextensive with the body. So we generally think that the mind is a series of neural connections that happen in our brain. We always see, like we always think that the mind is in our brain. But according to embodiment theorists and for embodiment practices, the mind is spread out throughout the body. The mind is some neural synapses that happen in your brain. The mind is also in your heart. The mind is in your belly. The mind is in your knees, in your feet. Everywhere where your body exists, your mind will also exist. And this was, wow, okay. I can't believe that this is a theory, you know, like it was so obvious, but obviously this is not how we operate. And embodiment practices, the reason why I'm talking about this wow moment that I had is because in embodiment practices, well, embodiment practices are practices that are sort of born and bred after the first psychedelic moment, so after the 60s, the 70s. And they are geared towards the idea that we can process a lot with our intellectual or rational capacities, but we can't process the whole of our lives like that. So trauma, I don't want to use the example of trauma. So very often not very often, but always as we grow up throughout life, what happens is that we pick up models of behavior. We pick up models of behavior. Okay, like I want to be fed, so I should behave like that. I want to be loved, we should behave like that. And these models we sort of reproduce as we grow up. These models are what I call rational sort of models, and they are and they become even more noticeable as we grow up. For example, your mom is like, no, you shouldn't cry, or no, you know, being angry is not really good. So what we do is we basically go into a mostly rational process of, okay, this is good behavior, this is bad behavior. If I behave like this, I'm gonna get what I need. If I behave like that, I'm not gonna get what I need. And what happens is we go thinking, obviously this doesn't happen in our conscious mind, it happens in our subconscious mind, but it is what I call a rational process. And I call it a rational process to differentiate it from deeply embodied process. So it will make more sense in a minute. So we sort of categorize good and bad behaviors, and we learn to become the good rather than the bad. So what happens is that whenever we classify behaviors as bad, or emotions as bad, or personality traits as bad, we immediately avoid feeling that. Okay, so okay, I'm angry, but I cannot be angry, because if I'm angry, then I'm gonna get a slap from my mom. Okay, so this is dangerous for me. I can't feel angry. What do? I don't feel it. I either repress it, or I am totally overwhelmed by it. There are various things that can happen, but what we're not doing is we're not processing the emotion. We're not, okay, let's feel the anger. Let's see what it's doing to my body. We're not taught to do this in our society. This is super problematic because emotions are physical, deeply physical states. Okay, so when we, in neuroscience, for example, when we want to measure the emotions, we will look at the heartbeat. We will look at whether we're sweating or not sweating, where we look at physical reactions to try to measure it. So what happens when we don't embody the emotion is that I may get over the fact that I'm angry with you because you were annoying. I may get over it psychologically, I may get over it rationally, intellectually, but inside of me, I'm not going to process the emotion properly. So what happens is these emotions sort of pile up inside of you. And then when you're like 30, 40, 20, 10, you start feeling that there is something wrong inside of you. And what embodied practices attempt to do is to create a safe space for you to process, let's say, emotions with your body. So we create a safe space. So what has been stored within you can come up and can be processed by means of feeling it. So instead of talking the way we do with the psychologist in embodied practices, we create a space for feeling. We allow the body to provide us with all of these things that are stuck within us so that we can feel through our rage, we can feel through our sadness, we can feel through our happiness, because the dark side of this dissociation mechanism is that the less we feel the ugly emotions, the less we're going to have space for feeling the beautiful ones. So what we do in embodiment is create a safe space for you to feel this uncomfortable emotion, to spend some time with them, to become acquainted with this part of you that is living deep within. So I think I have a quote that can help me here. Let's see how it works. I don't know how to do it. Here, I made it. Okay, obviously the quote is about trauma. Embodiment work, is usually like the reason why it was developed, it was to target trauma. So at the time when people coming back from Vietnam War were coming back and they were like super traumatized, obviously, there was no amount of psychology that could help them out. And so the beginning of embodied practice is born because of trauma, although now it's applicable for just generally personal transformation, let's say. So the quote says, beneath the surface of the protective parts of trauma survivors, there exists an essence, a self that is confident, curious, and calm, a self that has been sheltered from destruction by the various protectors that have emerged in their efforts to ensure survival. Once these protectors trust that it is safe to separate, the self will spontaneously emerge and the parts can be enlisted in the healing process. So the idea of embodied practices, so let's say, pretend that it doesn't say trauma, that we can read the quote as beneath the surface of the protective parts of the self, there exists an essence. And what we are doing here, what we do in embodiment, is showing the self that all of these protective mechanisms that we put into action in the everyday to be loved, for example, or to be accepted, are no longer necessary. So what we're doing is we're making sure that we create a space that we lift all of these protective dynamics, so that this essence that is there unscathed, what in philosophy, what in holotropic breathwork we often call the inner healer, or what in the healing space we often call the authentic self. So the authenticity word is what this essence is referring to. So what we do in embodiment is to show the self that all of these protective mechanisms are not necessarily needed. And this way we create space for this essence to emerge so that we can start living in a way that is more aligned with this essence, with our deeper or more authentic self, rather than being run by these protection mechanisms that keep us contracted and stuck into a certain version, a narrower version of ourselves. Okay, do you have any questions about embodiment? No? I know questions should be at the end, but I like questions. No, okay. Right. So that's the embodiment part. The contemplative part, on the other hand, refers to aims to capture the direct awareness and the transcendence that is phenomenological, the phenomenological awareness and state of transcendence that we can have in deeply embodied experiences. And the contemplative part also refers to the deeply reflective attitude that we have in metaphysics. When we are doing metaphysics, we are, yes, we're asking questions, yes, we're thinking logically, yes, we're applying our tools for deduction or induction, but what we're doing very often, and you cannot do philosophy without it, is contemplating, is stopping a second, deeply reflecting on that issue. So this is what the contemplative part of the title tries to capture, the sense of transcendence that we have when we think very deeply about an issue. And here I have another quote that can help us. Boom, here. For somebody who connected with this experiential domain, spirituality, says Stan Grof, but I want you to read embodiment, is not a matter of belief or interpretation of the world, but a deep knowing. And the contemplative aspect of contemplative embodiment refers to this deep knowing that we have when we go into embodied states. So that deep knowing that we have when we have an intuition within the metaphysical space. Okay, and then the second quote that I have to better, I spent a lot of time thinking about contemplative part of embodiment, and I decided that the best way was not to say myself, but to let other people speak, because I think contemplative in this case is a really intuitive. I looked for many definitions of contemplation, and none of them were actually capturing what contemplation means, and I am sure that everyone here has a sense of what a contemplative moment of contemplation is. So I'm just gonna use the quotes and I'm gonna hope that they make sense to you. So one of my philosophical loves is Alfred North Whitehead, which I'm sure you've heard a lot about, is he says, if you like to phrase it so, philosophy is mystical. For mysticism is a direct insight into depths as yet unspoken. But the purpose of philosophy is to rationalize mysticism, not by explaining it away, but by the introduction of novel verbal characterization, rationally coordinated. So the reason why I brought this quote is because it highlights the contemplative aspect of philosophy, the one where we're not just writing a set of data from one page into the other, but it's the process of philosophically, it's the process of exploring the questions that we're asking. Is my body distinct from my mind? I have to contemplate this if I want to give an answer that is not just based in what other people have said. And in this sense, philosophy is mystical. If you do philosophy, for me, doing a philosophy PhD has been the most intense personal retreat that I could ever do, because I really had to stop and contemplate. I really had to stop and think. I really had to stop and feel what these questions were telling me. I really had to go into the embodied space. Now, has any of you ever had an ontological shock? Yes. For me, I didn't know they were a thing. So I was like in the library and I read, and I read that, in physics, time doesn't pass. I still get goosebumps. It's like, wow, that's crazy. That's impossible. I felt like, the ground was opening beneath my feet. It was an incredible experience. And then that's when I understood what contemplation is, but I also understood what philosophy is. Because philosophy, I can do as much philosophy as I want. I can look into like the definition of physicalism and the causal closure principle. And yes, it all makes sense. But am I really doing philosophy the way that philosophy is supposed to be made? And we will go back to this at the end, a bit of a cliffhanger. So yeah, this is, does it make sense for you what contemplative is trying to capture? Yeah, okay. So you can ask questions, huh? Okay. Now, what are the tools of contemplative embodiment? The tools of contemplative embodiment are the coolest tools you could ever find. They are very primitive tools. We all have them. Yeah, we all have them. They are breath, movement, voice, or sound, and imagination. super, super simple. These are tools that are common to most embodiment practices. But the cool thing that I love about contemplative embodiment, and not just because it's my practice, but I just think it's so cool, is that I will never, ever give you exercises. I will never, ever tell you how to breathe, how to move, how to imagine things, but rather the whole contemplative embodiment process is based on guiding you, each person, to find their own path, to connect with their own inner self, to connect with their own inner process. So in a contemplative embodiment session, I will never tell you, okay, breathe 5 counts, like inhale on 5 counts, exhale for a long, like 7, 8 counts. Okay, when you move, try to keep your back straight. No, it's something totally different. Is connect to your breathing and try to breathe a little bit faster and a little bit deeper, which is something that I do borrow from. I want to say this. Contemplative embodiment is deeply inspired by holotropic breathwork in terms of the practice. So my practicing holotropic breathwork has been a life changer for me, not just because it helped me heal, but really because it brought me to that embodied space in a way that was really special for me. So a lot of my knowing of the breath, I owe it to Stan Grof's holotropic breathwork, and this is something that we find in contemplative embodiment. Something that is different, however, from contemplative embodiment to Grof's holotropic breathwork is the fact that to do that, you have to go into a retreat. You have to take a chunk of your time, and it's like doing a psychedelic ceremony. So you enter this huge, like super expanded states of consciousness, and then you come back to reality. The purpose of contemplative embodiment is to create a bridge between that super massive, crazy experiences on psychedelics or in holotropic breathwork or in mystical crisis and the everyday. So even though we do use the faster and breather dynamic that you could find in holotropic breathwork, you will never go into that sort of expanded state. That's one of the similarities but differences. And also the way that the session happens is totally different from holotropic. So yeah, we generally have exercising with breath, movement, and voice. I guide people to connect and find their own pathway, their own way to connect to themselves. And then we go into a more journey-like, especially in the initial sessions. And the journey can be a 1 hour long journey. But when I work especially one-on-one with clients, what we do is we break the journey down into smaller 5 minutes journey. And this is exactly because what the point of contemplative embodiment is to create a bridge between those hugely, massively expanded states and the everyday, so that we can play with going out and coming back, going out and coming back. And this is one of the reasons why contemplative embodiment can be good for the integration, but we're gonna go into it in a minute. So yeah, the purpose is to create a safe space for what needs attention to surface safely and explore it experientially. Okay, now this is the experimental part of me. I just cannot do things in a normal way. My mom, again, always tells me, like, can't you just do things normal? I tried, but I thought the best idea I could ever have, which I don't know if I'm regretting right now, no, I'm not regretting it, is maybe we should try to do a little bit of contemplative embodiment, because I don't think to talk about a practice does the practice any good. So who wants to have a taster? Anyway, you're gonna do it, so jump on the bandwagon with enthusiasm. Okay, so great, this is really exciting then. Okay, so tools are breath, movement, imagination, and voice. Imagination doesn't go in a taster session, so we're going to leave it out, or I'm going to leave it out from my guidance, but if images, or you can use it yourself if it happens. I know this sounds weird, but right now I'm talking to like your inner selves and they understand me, so don't worry about it. So we're going to go mostly into the breathing part and the movement part, and I'm just going to instruct you to follow what's happening naturally in your body. There is no right and wrong at all. As soon as you ask yourself whether there is a right and wrong, you're not being in your body. So just try to breathe, go back to your breath. Okay, I'm doing a soft one. I promise. Just a short one to understand what I mean when I say I don't give you exercises, I don't give you guidance, but rather it's about you finding your own pathway to connect. Okay, ready? Be comfortable on your seats. You can even sit on the floor if you want. I know that it's pushing it, but why not? Okay. I'm gonna have a little drink. And usually I use music as well, but I think it's nice to do it without. And also, the last thing I want to say, I am going to bring you to use voice, and especially for women, in my experience, it's impossible to use voice. It's really hard. The first times I was doing it by myself in my room, you know, to myself. So I was the only person in the room. I was just like, wow, can't get the sound out. If that happens, don't worry about it, just feel it, okay? But I will try to push it a bit. Okay, so let's close our eyes and simply bring attention to your breathing. Just notice how the air goes in and out, in and out. And then you can maybe play and take a deeper breath, filling your lungs and then letting the air out. Or maybe you could play with taking smaller breaths. Just play with your breath. And notice what happens in your body. If you're in your mind, or if the breath is going through, is taking you into your body. And try to catch that moment when you feel your body a little bit more. So we can do another deep breath, and maybe we can try to play with the breath by breathing a little bit faster and a little bit deeper. Just a little bit faster, just a little bit deeper. And following the path of the air, try to notice what's happening in your body, what's happening on your skin. Are you moving or are you contracted? What's happening on your skin? And as you keep breathing, notice that your breath is expanding your chest and contracting your chest. Expanding and contracting. And maybe you can exaggerate, you can make it bigger, this expansion and contraction. Go into the movement of your chest. Notice how your chest is expanding, and make that expansion a little bit bigger and the contraction a little bit bigger. Really dance that contraction and expansion. Go for it. Feel it. And notice what is happening in your body. If emotions are coming through, feel the expansion and the contraction. And then in the next exhale, you can maybe try to push the air out a little bit and maybe sigh. Trust your body. Trust your body, let your body guide you. Without judgment and without shame, feel the feeling. And maybe your voice wants to come out. Feel everything that comes through, allow it, allow yourself to feel it, and move with it. If it's annoyance, feel the annoyance. If it's fun, feel the fun. And then slowly, 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 bring your breath to a normal speed. We're gonna bring you back to the room. And as you come back to the room, don't just shut off everything that has happened. Whether something happened, whether nothing happened, there's always something. Don't shut it off, but come back, keeping a connection to it. Come back to your breath and come back feeling your skin, feeling you are in your skin. And when you're ready, open your eyes, maybe move your fingers, touch the chair, the floor. Okay, maybe have a little sip of water. Okay, is everyone here? Yeah, yeah. Hi. Hi there. Hey. Yeah, yeah, cool. You just think something? I'm gonna go back. What did you say? Should just conduct the rest of the presentation. We can do more of it. I love it. Okay, so this is a little taster, and the way that I structured it, well, I didn't, the way that I led it, let's say, is just to show you that we can access an expanded, little expanded state of consciousness, the way that we access when we go for retreats. In the everyday, we can do it almost immediately. If we are in a space, if we are guided, if we are in a safe space, if we want to, really. I understand, like, it was just 30 seconds, but for me, very often in like, well, okay, maybe a bit more than 30 seconds, but for me, very often, well, for me, this sort of 30 seconds is what have made a huge impact in my life when I started doing retreats, when I started doing psychedelics, when I went into like spiritual crisis. It was all about this 30 seconds that I could come back to my body. So I hope you did get a little bit of a taste of how powerful we can be, and we don't need to go to retreats. I mean, we still need to go to retreats, but we can also do other things. So maybe you have an idea about why this sort of practice is good for the integration of psychedelic or of non-ordinary states of consciousness, right? Do you think you got a bit of a grasp of why? Should I say a couple of words about it? Yeah, okay, right. So I think that this sort of practice, this is a practice that I craved a lot when I craved a lot, still crave it all the time. But what happens, what I do with contemplative embodiment, and the reason why it's helpful for integrating non-ordinary states of consciousness and mystical experiences, and also certain types of spiritual crisis, is that it creates a continuity of experience from the super wide expanded consciousness state to the everyday world. So what happens is I create a space, this continuity of what I mean by continuity of experience is to create a space where we can enter an expanded state of consciousness that is not super expanded, like I don't know what is happening, or wow, this is crazy. I'm living in like an outer world and I have no connection with the real world. Like obviously the world is not made of matter, it's like pure energy. So we're not going into that super expanded state, but we're going into a little bit of an expanded state so that we can go back to that experience. We can allow that experience to come through. And we spend time with that experience. We spend time with, oh, wow, the world is not matter, for example. I can feel that, I can have that experience. I can spend time with it, I can play with it because I am in an expanded state of consciousness, but I'm also grounded in reality at the same time. I'm not completely lost in another space. And this is given by the duration of the practice, by the fact that I am here to make sure that the practice, that your state doesn't go in a completely holotropic state, for example. So what we do is we create a continuity of experience that allows us to translate that experience, that peak experience, into something that we can access and use and harness in the everyday. So one of the craziest experiences I've ever had, I had them while doing holotropic breathwork, and I did have this experience of total connection with everything. I had this deep knowing, as Groff put it, that the world was not made of matter. I experienced it. I couldn't come out, like it was just super powerful for me. When I came out of the retreat space, I had a really, really, really awful time coming back to reality because I knew I was here, but I would hold the thing and I would know, I would have the deep knowing that this was not real. Now, I'm not saying that this is not real. I'm not saying that that's the truth, but that was my experience. I couldn't hold my phone. I couldn't hold a fork. I couldn't hold a conversation for 2-3 months. It was absolutely horrible. And I was seeking out help. I spoke to my psychologist. I spoke to the people that were doing holotropic breath. I was speaking to as many people as possible within the field of that, because then I couldn't really go and tell my other friends, is like, you know, I'm obviously like, this is an illusion and I don't even know why you're trying to talk to me, because I'd rather, you know, talk to a tree because I understand what the tree is telling me, but I don't understand what you're telling me. So what contemplative embodiment does, and unfortunately talking about these experiences does not always help. For me, it wasn't helpful. What I needed to do was to go back to that experience. But obviously I didn't want to go and take, you know, ayahuasca. I didn't want to go and do more holotropic sessions because it was the scariest thing on the planet for me. So what I needed was something that I could place in between that and this.
Could you tell us more about what holotropic breath is?
Oh, yeah, holotropic breath work is basically, do you know what breath work is?
I mean, I know from yoga what
from yoga.
Kind of breath work
Okay,
is.
so breath work is just a modality, is a healing modality, let's say, or it's a journeying modality, depending on why you approach it. And in breath work, you basically breathe for 3 hours. I'm going to say it in a really terrible way, and then I will tell you. Does anyone else not know what holotropic breathwork is? I should have thought about that before. I just gave it for granted. So holotropic breathwork is basically a way to get incredibly powerful psychedelic experiences by not taking any psychedelic substance, okay? So what happens in holotropic breathwork, very briefly, is you do breathing sessions of 3 hours and you go in crazy spaces. It's a psychedelic experience without psychedelics. So this is, I think, the most effective way I can tell you in a second, but I would be super happy to talk more about it because there is so much to it. And it was developed by Stanislav Grof, which is like the father of transpersonal psychology. Maybe you heard about him, Grof. Okay, so, and his wife, yes. Yes, thank you. Sorry, Christina. Yeah, it's true. Okay, so contemplative embodiment is meant to create that bridge, which is embodied, where we can go back to the experience, we can spend time with the experience, and then we can translate that experience into something that we can use in the everyday. Now, if the wind comes by, like if there is like a beautiful day, I can connect to that. And for me, that's one of the most beautiful experiences that I can have in the everyday. I can like touch the ground and feel that connection with the ground. Why? Because I managed to translate that super beautiful, but then traumatic experience into a tool that I have for my own life. As a result of properly integrating that experience by means of embodiment, I am now that experience. That experience is me, defines has broadened the narrow chinks of my life. Now, for me, that's an expanded version of reality, something that was not available to me. And with contemplative embodiment, what we do is we try to support the integration of that by bringing people into a lesser expanded state of consciousness so that they can translate super crazy experiences into everyday life and expand their conception of the self and of reality. Okay. Now, the other thing is the metaphysics. Okay, so what do you think you might have a guess why contemplative embodiment is good for metaphysics? Yeah, go for it. Thank you.
If you're talking about, the idea of the mental being dispersed through the body, then that kind of has implications more like on the panpsychist kind of view of metaphysics. Because if you've got like an emergentist materialist view, the idea that, your brain and these processes of neurons create it and the fundamental building blocks of reality is material, that doesn't really match up, or potentially it could, but not immediately match up with the idea of embodiment, where consciousness is more dispersed through your body.
Yeah.
And if that's actually the case, then the implication could be, and I'm sure you might agree with me, that the consciousness therefore is dispersed throughout the universe. That the argument isn't too difficult to make.
No, the argument is not too difficult to make. And I think you bring up a lot of good points. But also, what we do in contemplative embodiment is to give you the tools to do that sort of reasoning, but to bring the experience into that reasoning, okay? So the idea of what we can do for how we can help metaphysics with contemplative embodiment is the following. In my tutor, my supervisor, Kati Farkas, wrote in one of her papers that at one point it seemed that, I'm going to say it in very layman's ground terms, but this is the idea. At one point, it seemed that philosophy wasn't really advancing much, wasn't doing many advances. And then at the same time, we had science doing like, wow, creating crazy things that we can use like freezers and now mobile phones and cars, and philosophy was just like still asking the same questions. Like so what happened at one point, and I'm talking about maybe Cartesian times, so obviously they weren't making freezers, but you get the idea, is that we started importing into philosophy the methods, the objective methods of science. So philosophy became very deeply inspired by the scientific method. So that's one aspect, one of the problems that I think we have in metaphysics today. And the second one is the narrowness of the materialist paradigm. So I know there are a lot of views like panpsychism, like Russellian monism for people that are philosophers here, or like idealism that try to look beyond the materialist paradigm. But unfortunately, what science says, the objective view, the objective perspective is always central to the way we do metaphysics. Now, the problem is that the objective perspective is merely one of the perspectives that we have onto reality. And when we start doing contemplative embodiment, when we start doing holotropic breathwork, we see that there can be more to the objective perspective, that our subjective perspective has some truth to it. Okay, so the idea of contemplative embodiment is to be able to bring this subjective perspective into our philosophy making. Now, what do I actually mean with this? When we go and do, we're going and we do a psychedelic experience and we meet our ancestors. We have has any ever had an experience of a past life, for example? You can have experiences of past lives. You can have experiences of being at one with the cosmos. Now, obviously, as a philosopher, I'm like, wow, these experiences are telling me something. How do I translate them into making philosophy? Well, I'm not going to say, obviously, like I met my ancestors and I went back to my past life. So this means that there are past lives and past lives are true, because that would not mean to make philosophy. So obviously I have a subjective experience. I have an experience there that is part of my subjective perspective. How do I translate that into data that I can use for doing metaphysics? And obviously I don't have a formula for that yet, but the whole idea is that we can, the intensity, the variety, the texture of those experiences that we can have in non-ordinary states of consciousness must be translated, must be harnessed by the philosophers in order to think philosophically and not scientifically about the matter of consciousness, for example. So I think the best way is to give an example. So going back to that experience, I get goosebumps every time I even think about it. Going back to that experience I had of being completely connected with the cosmos, that experience that was, wow. One of the elements of that experience is that I felt like I was transcending my human limit and I was going into something else, okay? So when I came back, I was like, oh, wow, I felt like obviously, if I have to think about this experience, that is not something that I can hold in thought, what can I understand? What can I tease out of that experience? I was doing holotropic breathwork, so I didn't take any substance. Sometimes it helps not to take any substance, you know, to really trust that that experience is a real experience. At least for me, it's been like that. So, okay, what happened? Because I definitely had this experience and it has to make sense. And I know I'm not the only person who has these experiences. So what can I understand about this experience? I can understand that there is something wider and that I can transcend it. There is this transcendence. So if there is transcendence, it means that I have limits. And wow, I know I'm not God and I am therefore limited. I am a human being. I'm not you, I'm not you, I'm not you. Therefore, I am limited, okay? First point, super important. When we do metaphysics, we have to be aware that we are limited beings. The objective perspective is the perspective that belongs to a limited being. Okay, I'm not talking about truth here, but I'm talking about a reasoning. I harness that experience, that transcendence of the limit to think about my metaphysics. And I start from the fact that I am a limited being. Okay, so that's one of the things. That's one of the ways that I can translate such a huge, massive experience into my academic work. The second thing is, in that experience, sorry, I always have goosebumps. I can't talk about this in like a normal way. The second thing is that when I was there was mind, matter. These words made absolutely no sense. I go back and I wonder, why do I have to talk about mental and material when I do ontology? Where is this coming from? Okay, let's read about that. Descartes, mind, matter. Okay, there is a history to this. The scientific revolution. Okay, there is a history to this. The materialist paradigm. Okay, there is a history to this. It's guiding me. It's like, okay, but do we still need to think about mind and matter the way we did? Do we still? So it's about asking questions. Having that experience allowed me to ask some questions. And then I landed, well, I said already that I love Whitehead. And I landed on Whitehead and I was like, oh, okay, he's still talking about mind and matter, but maybe he's looking into something different. So long story short, in my thesis, for example, I develop and I defend a strand of neutral monism that I call perspectival neutral monism. And I play with the definition of neutral monism because still, even in neutral monism, when we want to leave behind the mental and the material, what do? We define the neutral stuff in terms of mental and material. Okay, wow, why? When I was there was no mental and material. Can I play with that? Yes, okay, so the neutral stuff, you guys have a great intuition, and I have had this experience. maybe we should just not use those terms. Maybe the neutral stuff is this more Spinozian thing where it's like a multitude of everything, an everythingness that can only be grasped from the perspective of the eternal. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense because it makes sense logically. It makes sense and rationally. I can do like all the objective tools that I have, but also my experience is leading me there. I'm harnessing the experiences that I have to go into that. And then, okay, and then we have subjective and objective perspective. I'm not going to go into the details of my thesis. You can ask me questions about it later, though, because it's super cool. But so this is an example of how you can translate that experience that you have from an experience to something that informs your philosophy. And I have to say, if I didn't have all of these journeys in expanded states of consciousness, my thesis would have been like my writing the thesis would have been a lot boring. And I don't know, like I brought innovation. Maybe it's my peers, like, you know, maybe this theory is not going to be the theory, but at least what we're doing is we're pushing the boundaries of a field that is super problematic because it took out experience. Galileo says the language of the universe is mathematics. Secondary qualities need to go out. But you know what? We've done that. We achieved a lot with this objective scientific method. And now that we have this huge treasure, we can take that extra step and start bringing back experience into our reasoning. And I think with contemplative embodiment, like the space that we create in contemplative embodiment is also a space where this sort of experiences can be processed, can be had with a concentration, not with a concentration, but with a focus on, okay, let's really understand those kind of experiences and make sense of them when we pair them with philosophical questioning. Something that I totally forgot, and I'm going to say to close I said at the beginning, but I forgot to say earlier, is one of the reasons why contemplative embodiment can be useful for integrating psychedelic experiences is because very often when we have these experiences, those experiences clash with our conceptual framework. And one of the ways in contemplative embodiment that I bring philosophy in is that if I give you the tools to question, the tools to think, the tools to navigate, the tools to deconstruct orthodox concepts, then those experiences can really be integrated within our conceptual framework as well. So this is how we have non-ordinary states and metaphysics, how they one feeds into the other. We use metaphysical tools to expand our ability to have these experiences and to bring them back into the everyday. And we use all of this beautiful world of experience to really go into the more academic and research, the more academic field that is thirsty, I think, of subjective perspectives. Okay. So I think I'm done. I have the last quote, which is here. Oops, is here. But the man, this is Huxley, who I heard was living around here for a while. But the man who comes back through the door in the wall will never be quite the same as the man who went out. He will be wiser, but less cocksure, happier, but less self-satisfied, humbler in acknowledging his ignorance, yet better equipped to understand the relationship of words to things, of systematic reasoning to the unfathomable mystery which it tries forever vainly to comprehend. And I mean, I don't need to explain it, no? Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Do I got the questions?
I don't know. Questions.
Okay.
Thank you so much for reminding us that we don't just spend our life like trying to understand philosophy. We read philosophy to try to understand life. I have an experience that I need to describe embodiedly. So I used to stomp. I used to like walk like this, like actually. And then I did this type of therapy called Feldenkrais, which is a Feldenkrais is like a therapist and a scholar, a member of what people call the somatologists, soma from the Greek body. And the basic kind of principle underlying all their thoughts, as I'm sure, and my question follows, is that we think with our body, basically. We don't just think with our brain. And, I find this throughout my life, the more complex my piano playing becomes, so the more complex my thinking becomes. And I don't think that's just a correlation. But my question to you then is, to what extent in your thesis were you influenced by somatologists like Feldenkrais? And do you think that is useful in psychedelic metaphysics and therapy?
Well, I think you can answer. There are so many answers.
I didn't finish. Sorry, I didn't finish.
Okay,
now
sorry.
I don't stomp anymore. He literally, this Feldenkrais therapist, he just like moved my legs in a certain way, and it was bizarre. And it took me a couple of months to realize that I was no longer stomping.
Yeah.
I was walking like and I used to sprain my ankles all the time. And after just one Feldenkrais thing, I mean, maybe it was his religious charisma, I don't know, but I think it was probably the system in place. I no longer stomped and I no longer twisted my ankles. Sorry, yeah, that was like the conclusion. So like, it was just, he moved like my body in a certain way, and it was mad basically. But my brain took time to catch up to what my body had already realized was going on. Yeah.
And that's the funny thing. The brain, the rational brain, the thinking brain, the brain that you're using to talk to me now and that I'm using to listen to you always catches up.
Yeah.
After. And so I didn't, I can't answer the question of how much embodiment influenced, like embodied experiences, or I wasn't reading, let's start from there. I wasn't reading about embodied experiences. I started from the experience itself.
From your own.
From my own and from other people's. So it happened kind of at the same time. I was I've always been one of those people that people call like empathic. I really could feel the other people's, which I think everyone does, but I made it a trait of my own childhood life. So for me, the embodiment was always something that I experienced very deeply. And then I started recreating it in practice. And then I think I'm hugely influenced by it, because I've always been really into like feeling emotions and exploring, like I've always been a psychonaut. So I think it has influenced me a lot, but at the same time, I've always been a very rational person. I was one of those children that was like super peaceful and like, don't worry, our parents will call us, etc., etc. And that's actually been a huge problem in my life. So I'm going to do this thing where I bring the subjective in a lot now, okay? It's always been like a
Tension?
Yeah, let's say attention, because I had to control the emotions a lot. And in philosophy, when I started doing philosophy, I was a physicalist. I started off, I was like, when I was studying law, I was sure that physics was a metaphor for human interaction, for human feeling. So I think there is something incredibly special about science. What encouraged me to look beyond physicalism was the fact that I just couldn't make sense of, the problem of physicalism are real, right? So sometimes I would have rather been a physicalist. My PhD would have been so much easier, maybe. But so I think I am influenced by it, but also there has been a lot of like really asking questions and staying in that rigid philosophical thinking for me to get to that point. So, and the whole thing is, like our concepts are embodied in a certain sense, and there is no separation from that. So yeah, of course I've been influenced by that. And the whole point is to allow that influence when the influence is felt.
Let's ask the question. Peter?
Peter,
Hi. Well, first of all, thanks, Marta. I feel like your talk was a trip in itself. Obviously, not as much as a trip as all of you got there. Really, I'm missing out today. Sorry. Yeah, my question is really the relationship between the embodied mind that you speak about and the extended mind. So you're talking about feeling the subjectivities in one's body and so on. How does that sort of practice, if it does at all, relate to nature connectedness, if it does? So, you know, you mentioned Whitehead, of course, and he speaks about, you know, the fact that we shouldn't talk about mind and body, we should talk about mind and nature. So I wondered if maybe you had some thoughts about that extended relationship.
Well, I have a lot of thoughts because actually, I don't know where to look, but I'm going to look this way so that. So nature connectedness is actually something that I'm thinking about a lot because it's really part of my own experience. I also live in the countryside. I'm really seeking out this. I'm really exploring this connection also as a result of many of this experience that I told you about. So the reason why I talk about embodiment is because it's it's how the word is mostly used, but that's not to the exclusion of the extended mind. Now, do I believe that the mind is like, I don't want to go into a philosophical debate over the extended mind. I don't know whether I like the theory, but experientially, when we talk about being like part of an ecosystem, I have an experience of that. So I do agree that the mind is extended. But if we go down that path where there are going to be a lot of, I think, transpersonal and spiritual implication, and that can be a whole other talk, which I would be really happy to have. So I just try to keep it to keep it a bit more simple, but the embodied is more biographical, so it's easier to access, but it's definitely like it's definitely an extend, like it's extended. The experience can be extended. What was the question? Sorry, I got lost.
There wasn't really a specific question. It's just, do you have thoughts on how the embodied mind relates to the extended mind, which you have now commented on? It'd be interesting to see if there's some kind of practice with regard to that extended mind as well, mind in inverted commas. But anyway, thanks a lot.
Yeah, we can work on that. Totally.
Thank you.
Oh yeah, mine's just a really simple question. I'm not a philosopher, so maybe really basic. You said it's a kind of two-way thing, and thanks very much again for a lovely talk. It's brilliant, and to have the experiential bit. And I can really understand how the experiential side informs metaphysics. Maybe that's because I'm not a philosopher, but you said the converse is true. So the metaphysics inform the experience. Can you describe a bit how that works? So your philosophical understanding changing your experience.
Yeah. So I think when I did this, I forgot to say this during the presentation. That's exactly what I forgot to say, and I tried to bring everything together, but a lot of the things couldn't. So thanks for the question, because I think that's one of the most exciting things for me about contemplative embodiment and about really playing with the two fields. So the way that I feel with myself, but also with the clients that I'm working with, especially when I work one-on-one, is what I call the tools for metaphysical inquiry. Okay, so let's do an example. In Eastern practices like Zen, meditation, other that I'm not really, or even when you're working with like medicine, for instance, you always have cosmologies that underpin those practices. And when you come out of a deep ayahuasca experience, for example, or a deep meditative practice, you can go back to a book and read about it in a certain sense. And you know that other people will have shared that experience, for instance. There is a cosmology and you have the tools to navigate that cosmology. With Western practices, we have the practice, but it's always detached from cosmology. So for example, even in holotropic breathwork, or even when you go into plant medicine, very often what we have is copy and paste of something that Ram Dass said. It's the cosmological underpinning is not very easily accessible, or is a bit copy and paste in the healing space. So the way that philosophy helps is, or that contemplative embodiment helps, is by giving the people the tools to think philosophically about the experience that they had. So when I introduce questions like you can think about, you can ask the question of what is the ultimate nature of reality? Is it like science says? Just the simple act of asking the questions can be a huge support. So what we do in metaphysics, or what we should do more often in metaphysics, is deconstructing. What I did so the first part of my thesis, my thesis is called Looking at the World with Fresh Eyes. And the first part of the thesis is the idea is the act of casting these fresh eyes, is the act of asking the questions. Where does mind and body, my concept of mind and body come from? Are they feasible? Are they concepts that I want to keep? For example, looking at the history, is the world ordered into levels of dependence? You know, when you start introducing these concepts, after people have experiences of the monster that lives inside of them, or experiences of, you know, being half dead and half alive, or they go through a death and rebirth process, to have concepts or questions or tools that help you go beyond the conceptual framework that you're taught in school and that we all live within in the everyday, can go a long way for informing your psychedelic practice. So what I noticed is that, yes, this was helpful for integrating, but also for preparing, because once you ask the question, is this chair really the way it looks? And then the answer is maybe, just maybe, you know, it's not yes or not, but just maybe, then you can play with that a lot more when you're doing a journey. You can, it's natural, because you have expanded your notion of reality. It goes back to the first intuition. Reality is much wider than what we're taught, than our conceptual framework capture. You know, and this is not, it's not a criticism. We needed that, but if so many people are coming and like wanting to, you know, if there is a psychedelic renaissance now, there is a reason, and the reason is that, you know, this is maybe it's too narrow. Like, why are we all feeling so crap? There is something, and you know, when you start expanding the boundaries of reality by deconstructing it conceptually, by deconstructing it experientially, and you enter this void, you need tools to navigate that void. You need tools that are experiential, you need tools that are conceptual, and there is a constant interplay between the two.
So it's more when you come out of the void, like the experience within the void just remains the same.
I think it does
change.
I think it does change.
Yeah, because you can play more, because you're more comfortable with it.
Yeah, and also because you're just conceiving of reality differently.
Yeah.
So it's not something that you can measure. Or maybe in the future it will be, but what I see is that, okay, so I have a client that is doing a lot of Kambo, for example, at the moment, and her Kambo experiences are a lot more productive, even though it's just Kambo, I don't know. It's weird to talk about it in a classroom. Because we started introducing this, like, you know, reality thing. Or another example is, yeah, okay, let's leave it at that. I have a lot of examples, but I think once you go into that, once you put the conceptual deconstruction, that's a preparation for the psychedelic experience. So you can get two different types of preparation. The preparation where, like, okay, and this might happen and this might not happen. Then you can have, and together with that, what I think is super useful, and what I'm doing with the contemplative embodiment is like, hey, let's have this sort of experience, and let's think about these experiences and of reality in a different way. And then when you go into that experience, it's just wider. I don't have a word rather than wider.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
So how was that? What you say? Yeah. So you, Captain, having a critical stance towards science, but I want to ask, what specific kind of science is it that you have a trouble with that doesn't incorporate this different kinds of knowing it came from embodied experience or the experiential, the subjective itself. Because there's definitely aspects of scientific work that try to incorporate it. There's one that you might like or may also know already is neurophenomenology, was a lot of people and like psychology itself, although now it is a very formalized, like measure-oriented, data-oriented science that tries to sweep introspection under the rug. It started through introspection. It started through the science of subjective experience of wound until it led to behaviorism, and then we kind of like went on with this, and we haven't really done the proper rehab from behaviorism. It still informs the way we view mind in a scientific sense. So
I don't have a question, sorry.
no worries.
No worries.
So like what I want to get at, the point I want to get at is because I've seen it in philosophy too. Philosophy also most of the times stays in this propositional mode of we need to think through language and we need to universalize our statements, generalize them, and then you lose all of experience. You lose embodiment, you lose subjectivity, you lose a personal anchor you have to even make this point. So is there something behind both science and philosophy that might be the culprit here? That's where that keeps us away from truly coming to terms with the richness and the depth of the experience. Can we call it somehow rather than saying science?
First of all, I don't think science is bad. Maybe you didn't make it clear. I spend a lot of time, for example, in my PhD, talking about the fact that science is a great epistemic project, but it is an epistemic project. So science is great and philosophy is great philosophy also needs to think in propositional terms, for example, for doing certain things. But if we're doing metaphysics of consciousness, that's not enough. If we're doing consciousness studies, the objectiveness that is attached to scientific reasoning, I think is not enough. And it's not just my opinion. I think it's obvious that this is a problem when we start looking at the mind-body problem, for example, when we start to look at the fact that we're not really finding consciousness, even if we're looking in the brains. And so I think these are great. And I don't want to throw away the water in the pram, is that?
Baby with the bathwater.
The baby with the bathwater.
I like it.
The baby with the bathwater. But I just don't think it's necessarily how we have to think about everything. Now, if we want to have a complete description of reality, one that includes consciousness, I just don't think that science or the objective perspective will do. So to go a little bit more in the detail, I think science is great and it's the most successful explanatory project of reality that we have so far. But science is not maybe made, to explain consciousness. Science, the reason why science is so successful is because Galileo and then Descartes and then everyone else, they're like, hey, let's do maths. Let's understand why the apple falls to the ground rather than floating. And if science is so successful, it's because we did take experience out of the equation. Now, after few years of that, can we try something else? Because we're still not finding consciousness through science, okay? So philosophy of science, thinking in propositional terms when we're talking about the passage of time or the space-time, super appropriate, absolutely. Should we use propositional knowledge when we're talking about what it is like to be in pain for me now? I don't know if I can, right now, it doesn't look like science is gonna do the trick. And that's why I think And also, science and the materialist paradigm are our intellectual paradigm. We live by the knowledge that this chair is real. It is real in this level of experience, but this is not the only level of experience that we have that is available to us. When you're sleep deprived, when we can have a lot, and we can talk about them in physicalist terms, but do we need to just talk about them in metaphysical terms? And the purpose of the work that I do is to bring in this question and to bring in the experiment to, and then maybe at the end we will go back to physicalism and we will go back to science, and that's still the best thing that we have. But why not explore? And that what I want people to do, and when I talk about subjectivity and bringing contemplative embodiment as a way to bring the experience back into philosophy, it's hey, let's play with the realm of life that we're not tapping in when we're doing propositional arguments. First.
We have about 2 more minutes. Normally we finish at 5, and I have at least 3 more questions.
Yeah, okay.
When people ask you questions, how do you want to manage it?
I don't know. I'm flexible.
You can either have one question after the other and then answer
Mine's
it,
really quick.
or you collect the question.
I answer quick, but not one after the other because I will forget the first one.
Do you ever say to your brother?
He was first for sure.
But that doesn't make you the first.
Okay.
That would be quick.
Thank you for that. That was really beautifully impassioned.
Oh,
First of all. I just wanted to ask about, you mentioned, I think it was from a psychedelic experience where you experienced that matter wasn't real and everything, and therefore whether anything was real came into question. And it sounded like a really negative, horrible experience from the sounds of things when you were living through it. Do you think that was a necessary precondition to get to your understanding of everything now, the universe? And as a sort of add-on to that, what if you wouldn't have integrated it? That doesn't sound like it would have ended well.
Mm-hmm. Well, the experience itself was the most beautiful experience ever. I suggest it, but just make sure you have someone that you can talk to afterwards. It was the integration that was an absolute nightmare. And the experience itself wasn't that there is no matter, but it was that there is so much more there is this like fluidity that this version of reality just doesn't capture. And what was the add-on question?
So was that a necessary precondition to get to your sort of understanding now of the universe and contemplative embodiment? I mean, do you need to go through that experience?
No, I don't think you need to go through any experience. I think everyone needs to go through exactly the experiences that they go through. And there is, to answer it briefly so that we can do the other question. It was necessary for me to heal some stuff for sure. Would it have happened if I wasn't studying metaphysics of consciousness? Maybe not. To also answer that, would it have happened at that point? Maybe not.
So I found 2 things really, well, I found a lot of what you said very interesting, but 2 things stuck out to me that you kind of referred to. And one was like maths, or you said briefly, like the language of the universe is written in maths, and referring to the symbiotic relationship kind of between metaphysics and psychedelic experiences, and that, psychedelic experiences can help your conceptual understanding of metaphysical concepts, and metaphysics can help you integrate your psychedelic experience. In maths, the really cool thing, or at least I think, and maybe I'm making my nerdiness quite apparent, one of the recent projects in the past couple hundred years in mathematics has been quite successful, is merging different aspects of maths together. So for example, group theory and linear algebra, you can literally reduce a problem about symmetries into matrix algebra. And then using the tools that we've developed in matrix algebra, we can solve problems about symmetry, which doesn't seem to immediately be apparent why that is. My question then is, if there was a way that we could literally map metaphysical concepts to psychedelic experiences, for example, that feeling of, being one with that universe, literally mapping it to Spinoza's neutral monism, would we be able to use psychedelic experiences and the phenomena of that to actually solve questions and answer questions in metaphysics?
So that's a huge question, and that's something that you should totally research. I don't know, but I do think that actually we have the experiences, like that knowledge is within every one of us, like we are nature. And for me, it's really a matter of getting there, and metaphysics and experience together can sort of give us maybe a highway to that embodied knowing that, for example, Groff was talking about. I don't know if you could map, you know, I'm not a fan of measuring and mapping. I'm more of the experiential side, but it's something that I would love to read.
It has been done. We're going to discuss it later.
Discuss with photos. I think E.E. Cummings once said, pleasure and pain are both surfaces, one itself showing itself hiding one. Life's only true value, neither is. Love makes the little thickness of the coin. My question is, could you say to your brother, I oxytocin you?
Maybe, if it's cool, if he gets it, then why not?
Right, okay. Okay.
But about the pleasure pain, I think there is a huge part to that in philosophy, like in doing philosophy, in the commonality between philosophy and, you know, the more you go, when you're doing philosophy, the more you go in, or any sort of academic research, the more you go into that, like, oh, I don't know, I want to know the answer. The more then you go, you know, it's about the dance between the contraction and
the outer, right?
And it's the same, and maybe this go back to the mapping. It's the same when you have the psychedelic experiences, you know, and the whole point of integration, the whole point of philosophy is to be able to dance, to go through this contraction and expansion. And when I talk about bringing experience into philosophy and philosophy into experience, is to facilitate that pain, pleasure.
Little thickness of the coin, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
Now I get why you love like a whitehead.
Whitehead.
Yeah, I love him. I
Thank
wish
you
it could
so
be him.
much. I think we're going to the top, right? Thank you, everyone online.
Oh yeah. Beautiful scar.